He, a ruthless businessman. She, a woman who had abandoned her dreams. When fate united them at the piano, each note played revealed secrets, desires, and feelings that could no longer be ignored. But can music overcome the barriers between their vastly different worlds? Thomas Blackwell gazed at the sunset through the enormous windows of his mansion in the Hamptons, his fingers drumming idly on the Italian marble table, the golden reflection of the sun on the waters of the private beach his property overlooked couldn't ease the restlessness that had consumed him for months. At 45, he had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. One of the largest construction companies in the country, considerable wealth, and respect in the real estate market. However, something was missing. He rose from the leather armchair and walked through the immense living room, his footsteps echoing on the impeccably polished marble floor. The walls boasted expensive works of art, each meticulously chosen by renowned decorators, but none of them seemed to truly touch him. His eyes fell on the gleaming black grand piano, strategically positioned near the veranda. It was a magnificent piece, a Steinway & Sons that had cost a small fortune, but which, since its arrival 3 months ago, served more as a decorative object than a musical instrument. The idea of learning piano came during a trip to Vienna, when he attended a concert at the famous Musikverein. The music transported him to a place that even his greatest business achievements had never managed to reach. At that moment, he decided he needed to experience that feeling for himself. As with everything in his life, he turned desire into a goal. He would buy the best piano and hire the best teachers. The first teacher, Victor Steinberg, an internationally renowned Russian, lasted only 2 weeks. His rigid methodology and lack of patience with Thomas's mistakes culminated in a heated argument that ended with the teacher slamming the mansion door, cursing in his heavy Russian. The second, Paul Merrick, known for his modern teaching approach, lasted a bit longer, but his experimental methods only served to increase Thomas's frustration. On that particular afternoon, after another disastrous attempt to practice alone, Thomas felt particularly irritated. The notes came out disjointed, his fingers seemed to disobey his brain's commands, and the melody he was trying to reproduce sounded more like childish cacophony than proper music. Sarah Grace, or simply Grace as everyone called her, discreetly observed the scene while performing her daily tasks. Having worked in the house for 12 years, she knew every corner, every object, every mood of her employer. Dressed in her impeccable light blue uniform, she moved silently through the room, arranging the sofa cushions and adjusting the fresh flower arrangements that arrived every morning. Thomas, absorbed in his frustration, didn't notice the understanding looks his employee gave him when he missed a particularly difficult sequence of notes. Grace continued her methodical work, but her attentive ears caught every mistake, every hesitation, every sigh of discontent from her employer. The afternoon wore on and the golden sunlight began to tinge the room with orange hues. Thomas, determined to master at least one simple sequence, persisted in his attempt. His fingers slid over the keys with the precision of an elephant in a china shop. The growing frustration was visible on his face, normally controlled and serene. It was then, in a moment of particular irritation, that his hands came down hard on the keys, producing a dissonant sound that echoed through the room. Grace, who was nearby adjusting the curtains, couldn't contain a small start. Thomas, noticing her presence for the first time that afternoon, turned to her with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. "I'm sorry, Grace. I didn't mean to startle you," he said, running his hands through the grey hair at his temples, a gesture she recognized as a sign of his nervousness. It was at this moment that something changed in Grace's usually restrained expression. Her brown eyes, normally lowered in a respectful attitude, met Thomas's with a different intensity. Her hands, calloused from years of housework, slightly tightened the cleaning cloth she was holding. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, her soft voice carrying an unusual hesitation, "if I may, perhaps I can help." Thomas raised his eyebrows, surprised not only by the unexpected offer but also by her tone of voice, which carried a confidence he had never noticed before. Before he could respond, Grace continued, her words coming out, firmer now. I used to play the piano. In fact, I studied for many years when I was younger. The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of waves breaking on the beach. Thomas looked at his maid as if seeing her for the first time. There, standing in her simple uniform, still holding the cleaning cloth, was a woman he thought he knew after 12 years, but who suddenly revealed herself to be a complete stranger. "You play the piano?" he asked, his voice betraying the disbelief he felt. Grace nodded slightly, a small smile appearing on her lips. "I used to play. It's been a while, but—" She hesitated again. "If you'll allow me, I can show you." Thomas stood up from the piano bench, gesturing towards the instrument. Grace approached cautiously, as if fearing the invitation might be withdrawn at any moment. She placed the cleaning cloth on a nearby table and sat down on the bench, her back naturally straightening in a posture that betrayed years of practice. Her fingers rested gently on the keys, and for a moment she closed her eyes, as if reconnecting with a long-forgotten part of herself. When she began to play, the world stopped. The first notes of Clair de Lune by Debussy flowed through the room like crystal-clear water, filling every corner with a beauty Thomas had never imagined possible from that instrument that had frustrated him so much. The music grew and diminished under Grace's fingers, as if she and the piano were one being. There was no hesitation, no error, just a perfect dance between musician and instrument. Thomas watched, mesmerized, as the hands that normally held cleaning products and organized his house now created pure magic. When the last note dissipated in the air, the silence that followed seemed almost sacred. Grace opened her eyes slowly, as if awakening from a dream. Her hands rested gently on her lap, and she resumed her usual posture, slightly hunched, as if trying to occupy less space. "That was extraordinary," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. Why did you never mention this before?" Grace smiled sadly. "Some stories are better kept hidden, Mr. Blackwell. Life doesn't always allow us to follow our dreams." Thomas sat down in a nearby armchair, his eyes still fixed on his maid, now seen in a completely new light. "Tell me your story, Grace, please." And so as the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Grace began to unveil her past, revealing a life rich in music and dreams, but also marked by difficult choices and necessary sacrifices. It was the beginning of a journey that would change not only the relationship between employer and employee, but the very essence of who they were. Thomas's office was illuminated only by the Italian designer lamp on his solid mahogany desk. It was almost midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts kept returning to the scene from the afternoon. Grace, his employee of so many years, revealing herself to be an extraordinary pianist. Her words still echoed in his mind, telling a story he never imagined existed behind that discreet figure who silently moved through his house. "I started studying piano at 6, she had told him, her eyes lost in distant memories. "My mother worked as a janitor at the New York Conservatory of Music. The director, Dr. Frank Martin, was a kind man. When he saw me pretending to play on the old piano in the storage room during my mother's breaks, he decided to offer me free lessons." Thomas recalled every detail of the conversation. Grace described how she spent hours practicing on that old piano, while her mother cleaned the conservatory rooms. The girl's natural talent soon caught the attention of the teachers. By 12, she was already performing in student recitals, always wearing borrowed dresses and shoes a size too big, but with a smile that lit up the stage. "At 16, I won a scholarship to study at the conservatory itself," she continued in her narrative. "Dr. Frank said I had potential for an international career. We started planning my trip to Germany, where I could perfect my studies." It was at this point in the story that Thomas noticed how Grace's hands tightened against each other, her knuckles whitening slightly. The young pianist's dream was interrupted when her mother fell seriously ill. The money saved for the trip to Germany was used for medical treatments. Grace abandoned her studies to work and help with expenses. Now sitting in his luxurious office, Thomas realized how ironically unfair life could be. While he accumulated fortunes building high-end developments, talents like Grace's remained hidden, suffocated by the need for survival. The next morning, Coffee was served promptly at 7 o'clock, as always. Grace maintained her usual routine, as if the previous day's revelation hadn't happened, but there was something different in the air, a subtle tension, an unspoken expectation. "Grace?" Thomas called, as she prepared to leave with the coffee tray. "Do you still have contact with your old teacher, Dr. Frank?" She paused for a moment, her hands holding the silver tray firmly. He's no longer with us, Mr. Blackwell. It's been 5 years." Thomas noticed how she swallowed hard before continuing. "But I still keep in touch with some colleagues from the conservatory. Some pursued careers in music, others like me took different paths. And you never played again after you started working?" A small, sad smile appeared on Grace's lips. "Sometimes, when I clean your piano, my fingers itch to play, but it would be inappropriate." Thomas stood up abruptly, surprising her. "Inappropriate? Grace, what's inappropriate is wasting a talent like yours. From today on, I want you to set aside 2 hours every morning to practice on the piano." Her eyes widened in surprise. "But, Mr. Blackwell, my duties—" "Your duties can wait," he interrupted. "In fact, I'm going to hire someone else to help with the household tasks, and—" He hesitated for a moment. "I'd like you to teach me. If you're willing, of course." The tray trembled slightly in Grace's hands. "You want me to be your teacher?" "Yes," he replied firmly. "The other teachers tried to teach me technique, but you have something different. Yesterday, when you played, I realized that music isn't just about positioning your fingers correctly or reading sheet music. It's about feeling, isn't it?" Grace placed the tray on the nearest table, her now free hands revealing a slight tremor. "Mr. Blackwell, I don't know if it would be appropriate—" "Please," he interrupted again, his voice softer now. "Forget for a moment that you're my employee. Think only about the music. Don't you miss it?" The question hit Grace like a wave. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and she needed a few seconds to regain her composure. "Every day," she finally answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Then, it's decided," Thomas declared. "Starting tomorrow, we begin the lessons. And I want you to use the piano whenever you wish. This house needs more music." That night, after everyone had retired, Grace remained in the main room, observing the piano. Her hands, which during the day had washed dishes and made beds, now trembled with the possibility of creating music again. She sat silently on the bench, her fingers barely touching the keys. The full moon illuminated the room through the large windows, creating dancing shadows on the black piano. Grace closed her eyes and began to play, very softly, an old lullaby that her mother used to hum. The notes floated in the night air like small fragments of long-forgotten dreams. From the upstairs hallway, Thomas observed the scene without being noticed. The music rose up the stairs like a delicate web of emotions, and he realized that something was changing. Not just in his house, which now gained a new soundtrack, but in his own heart, which was beginning to see beauty where before there was only functionality. In the library of his mansion, an old black-and-white photograph caught his attention. It was of his own mother, sitting at the piano in his childhood home. A long-buried memory emerged, her playing for him to sleep, her delicate hands dancing over the keys, creating magical worlds through music. Perhaps that's why the piano called to him so much now, an unconscious connection to an almost forgotten past. Grace's music continued to rise up the stairs, each note laden with contained emotion, with deferred dreams, with possibilities that now, unexpectedly, were coming back to life. Thomas realized that it wasn't just him who was about to learn something new. Perhaps through this unlikely partnership, both could rediscover parts of themselves that had been silenced by time and circumstances. The first official lesson was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning. Grace had woken up before sunrise, restless with her new responsibility. She prepared Thomas's breakfast with special attention, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the silver tray. Emily, the new helper hired to assist with household tasks, curiously observed her colleague's nervous movements. "Have you taught before, ma'am?" Emily asked, while organizing the pantry according to the instructions received. Grace paused for a moment, her hands unconsciously smoothing her impeccably ironed apron. "Just a few private lessons a long time ago to help with household expenses," she replied with a restrained smile. "But never for someone like Mr. Blackwell." The morning sun was already infiltrating its golden rays through the wide windows when Thomas came down the stairs wearing one of his usual Italian suits. Grace noticed that he seemed more formal than usual, as if he too was nervous about the change in his routine. "Good morning, Grace," he greeted, sitting down at the breakfast table. "I hope you're ready to start our musical partnership." The word partnership hung in the air for a few moments, laden with implicit meanings. It was no longer just a relationship between employer and employee, but something new, still undefined, that was beginning to take shape. At 9 o'clock, sharp, both were in front of the piano. Grace had exchanged her uniform for a simple but elegant dress that Thomas had insisted on buying, especially for the lessons. Her hands, still marked by years of housework, rested gently on the keys. "Before we start with the notes," she said, her voice gaining a confidence that surprised them both, "I need you to understand something fundamental about music." Thomas straightened up on the bench, attentive. It was strange to see Grace in that position of authority, but there was something naturally captivating about her presence when she spoke about music. "The piano is not just an instrument," she continued, gently pressing a key. "It's an extension of our soul. Each note has a story, an emotion. When we play, we're not just reproducing sounds, we're telling stories." Her words echoed through the room, mingling with the solitary note that still vibrated in the air. Thomas realized that he had never thought about music in this way. For him, until then, it was just another skill to be conquered, like closing a business deal or learning a new language. The following hours passed like minutes. Grace began by teaching him to simply feel the instrument, to recognize each key, not only by its position but by its unique personality. Her explanations were interspersed with small stories from her own musical journey, moments of discovery and learning that she now shared with her unlikely student. "I remember the first time I managed to play a complete song," she recounted, while guiding Thomas's hands over the keys. "It was a simple melody, but to me it seemed like the most extraordinary thing in the world. Dr. Frank said something I never forgot. True music isn't in the notes, but in the silences between them." Thomas found himself completely absorbed in Grace's words. There was a wisdom in her way of teaching that went beyond technique. She didn't just show where to position the fingers, but how to feel the music, how to let it flow naturally. As the morning progressed, something began to change in the dynamic between them. The formalities gradually dissolved, replaced by a nascent complicity. When Thomas finally managed to play a simple sequence of notes without errors, Grace's smile lit up the entire room. "See," she said, her face radiant with satisfaction, "you have music inside you. You just needed to find the right way to let it out." During lunch, served on the veranda overlooking the sea, Thomas surprised Grace by inviting her to sit at the table with him. The gesture, seemingly simple, represented a significant break from the house protocols. "Tell me more about your life at the conservatory," he asked as they savored a meal prepared by Emily. "What was your daily routine like there?" Grace hesitated for a moment, her hands adjusting the napkin on her lap. Then, as if a dam had broken, she began to share long-kept memories. She spoke about the cold mornings in New York, when she arrived early to practice on the storage room piano, about the colleagues who came from wealthy families with their expensive instruments and elegant clothes, and how music was the only language that really mattered when everyone was playing together. "There was a colleague, Bethany," Grace recalled, her eyes shining with the memory. "She came from a traditional family, studied with the best teachers in Europe, but she always said she envied my way of playing because I put my soul into every note." Thomas watched fascinated as Grace transformed when talking about music. It was as if an inner light turned on, illuminating every word, every gesture. The shy and reserved woman he had known for years gave way to someone completely different, someone who radiated passion and knowledge. "And what happened to Bethany?" he asked, genuinely interested. "She pursued a career in music, performs in major theaters across Europe," Grace replied. a touch of melancholy in her voice. "Sometimes I see news about her in classical music magazines. It seems she achieved all the dreams we shared back then." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of waves breaking on the beach. Thomas realized there was much more to his employee than he had ever imagined. Years of daily interaction, and only now was he beginning to really know her. The afternoon brought more piano practice, but now there was a different atmosphere in the air. The social barriers, though still present, began to dissolve through music. Thomas found himself sharing his own insecurities, his fears of failure, his doubts about the meaning of so much material success. "You know, Grace," he said, while trying to master a particularly challenging sequence, "sometimes I wonder if I've spent my whole life chasing the wrong things." She looked at him with understanding, her hands resting gently on the keys. "It's never too late to find a new path, Mr. Blackwell. Music has that power to show us possibilities we didn't even know existed." At the end of that first day of lessons, when the sun was already setting on the horizon, tinging the sky pink and orange, Thomas realized that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just about learning to play the piano, it was about rediscovering a part of himself that had been stifled by years of pursuit of success and recognition. Grace gathered her sheet music, preparing to return to her household duties, when Thomas called out to her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want you to tell me more about your performances at the conservatory. And maybe you could play something for me again." The smile that lit up Grace's face was answer enough. As she walked away, Thomas remained at the piano, his fingers gently touching the keys, feeling for the first time not just the notes, but the story that each of them carried. Weeks turned into months, and the routine in the mansion had adapted to the new rhythm dictated by music. Every morning after breakfast, Thomas and Grace dedicated 2 hours to the piano. The progress was remarkable, not just in Thomas's musical abilities, but in the way the entire house seemed to breathe a new energy. Emily, the new employee, had already grown accustomed to hearing the melodies that filled the environment while she performed her tasks. Sometimes she would discreetly stop to observe the lessons, fascinated by the transformation that happened during those hours. The powerful businessman and the shy housekeeper transformed into teacher and student, united by the universal language of music. On a particularly sunny morning, while Thomas was practicing a piece by Mozart, the doorbell rang. It was Olivia, his younger sister, arriving without warning as she was wont to do. The sound of the piano immediately drew her to the main room, where she found her brother completely absorbed in the music, with Grace at his side, gently guiding his hands over the keys. "I didn't know you had gone back to giving lessons, Grace," said Olivia, her voice laden with genuine surprise. Thomas and Grace interrupted their practice, startled by the unexpected presence. Olivia had known Grace since she started working in the house, but had never known about her musical past. "Actually," Thomas replied, rising to greet his sister, "Grace is teaching me, and I must say, she's the best teacher I've ever had." Olivia looked from one to the other, sensing something different in the air. The way her brother spoke about Grace, the gleam in her eyes when the topic was music, there was a complicity there that went beyond the teacher-student relationship. "This reminds me of our mother," Olivia commented, approaching the piano. "Remember how she loved to play for us, Thomas, especially on stormy nights when we were scared?" Thomas nodded, a nostalgic smile on his lips. "Grace reminds me of her. Sometimes. She has the same gentle way of teaching, the same passion for music." The comment made Grace blush slightly, her hands nervously adjusting the sheet music on the piano. Olivia noticed the gesture and smiled inwardly. She knew her brother well and could see that something was changing in him. "Why don't you play something for us, Grace?" Olivia suggested, sitting in a nearby armchair. "I'd love to hear you play." Grace looked hesitantly at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. She sat at the piano and, after a moment of concentration, began to play a piece by Chopin. The music flowed from her fingers like crystal water, filling the room with palpable emotion. Olivia watched fascinated, not only by the extraordinary performance, but mainly by her brother's expression as he watched Grace play. There was an admiration there that went beyond respect for musical talent. It was something deeper, more personal. When the music ended, the silence that followed was laden with emotion. Olivia was the first to break the spell, applauding enthusiastically. "That was incredible, Grace. Why did you never tell us you played so well?" Before Grace could answer, Emily's voice came from the door of the room. "Miss Olivia, lunch is served." "Grace, please join us," Olivia invited, standing up. "I want to know more about your history with music." Lunch turned into a special occasion. For the first time, Grace sat at the table with the Blackwell siblings, sharing not just the meal, but also stories from her life. Olivia listened fascinated to the accounts of the conservatory, the performances, the interrupted dreams. "Have you ever thought about performing again?" Olivia asked as they savored dessert. Grace shook her head gently. "That's in the past. Now I have other responsibilities, other priorities." "But the talent is still there," Thomas interjected. "Maybe it's time to rethink those priorities." Olivia observed the exchange of glances between her brother and Grace. There was a story developing there, something that perhaps even they hadn't realized yet. After lunch, Olivia asked to speak privately with her brother in his office. Thomas knew some kind of sermon was coming. He knew that determined look of his younger sister well. "What's going on here, Thomas?" she asked, as soon as she closed the office door. "What do you mean?" "Between you and Grace. This piano lesson story, the looks, the way you talk about her." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't know what you're talking about, Olivia. Grace is my piano teacher, that's all. And also your employee," Olivia reminded him. "You need to be careful, Thomas. I don't want anyone to get hurt in this story." "There is no story," he defended himself, but his voice betrayed an uncertainty that didn't go unnoticed by Olivia. "Just promise me you'll think carefully about what you're doing," she asked, her voice softer now. "Grace is an extraordinary woman, and you seem happier than ever. But the situation is complicated." Thomas remained silent for a moment, observing the sea through his office window. Olivia's words had touched on something he had been trying to ignore for the past few weeks. "You know," he finally said, "since I started these lessons, for the first time in years I feel alive. It's not just the music, Olivia. It's as if Grace had shown me a completely new world, a world where success isn't measured by the size of the bank account." Olivia smiled, recognizing in her brother a change she had long hoped to see. "Just be careful with her heart. And with yours." That night after Olivia left, Thomas remained in the piano room until late. His hands glided over the keys, trying to reproduce the magic he saw in Grace's hands. From the hallway, without him noticing, she watched him, her heart torn between the joy of seeing him evolve in music and a growing feeling that scared her. Emily, passing silently to check if all the doors were locked, caught Grace's gaze. There was a story developing there, a melody not yet played, a score being written by fate in notes that no one could yet read. Autumn arrived, bringing a cooler breeze and golden leaves that danced through the mansion's garden. Thomas had progressed significantly in his piano skills, but something deeper was changing within him. The mornings with Grace had become the most anticipated moment of his days, and it wasn't just because of the music. On a particularly inspiring morning, while they were practicing a simple duet, their fingers accidentally touched on the keys. It was a brief moment, almost imperceptible, but enough to make them both feel an electric current run through their bodies. The silence that followed was deafening. "I think we should take a break," Grace suggested, abruptly rising from the piano bench. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the sheet music. Thomas watched her walk to the veranda, her simple but elegant dress moving gently with the sea breeze. In recent months, she had begun to dress differently for the lessons, abandoning the uniform for clothes more appropriate for a piano teacher. The change wasn't just external, there was a growing confidence in her posture, a special gleam in her eyes. "Grace," he called, joining her on the veranda, "have you ever thought about performing in public again?" She turned, surprised by the question. "Mr. Blackwell, that was a long time ago. I don't even know if I still—" "You're extraordinary," he interrupted, his voice laden with an emotion that surprised him. Your talent shouldn't be hidden inside this house. Grace felt her heart race at his words. You don't understand. My life is different now. I have responsibilities, commitments, which can be adjusted, he completed. I want to help you. Realize your dream, Grace. Let me do this. The sea breeze stirred her hair, bringing with it the aroma of salt air and unrealized possibilities. For a moment, Grace allowed herself to dream again, to imagine herself on stage, sharing her music with the world. I have a friend, Thomas continued, taking a step closer. He's the director of Carnegie Hall. I can arrange an audition if you want. Grace's eyes filled with unshed tears. Why are you doing this? Thomas hesitated, realizing that the answer to this question was more complex than he would like to admit. Because you taught me to see beauty where before I only saw numbers. Because your music awakens something in me that I thought I had lost a long time ago. The moment was interrupted by Emily, who appeared discreetly to announce that lunch was served. Grace took the opportunity to withdraw, her emotions in turmoil. During lunch served on the veranda as had become customary, Thomas observed Grace with different eyes. She was no longer just his employee or his piano teacher. She was an extraordinary woman who, due to life circumstances, had buried her dreams to survive. You know, he said, breaking the contemplative silence, my mother used to say that music has the power to reveal who we really are. Grace raised her eyes from her plate, meeting his gaze. Your mother was a wise woman. Yes, she was, Thomas agreed, a nostalgic smile on his lips. And I think she would love to see how you brought music back to this house. The afternoon brought with it heavy clouds, heralding a storm. Thomas had cancelled all his meetings for the day, something unthinkable a few months ago. Now sitting at the piano, he tried to master a particularly challenging piece that Grace had chosen for him. You're thinking too much, she observed, noticing his growing frustration. Music doesn't come from the mind, it comes from the heart. How do you make it seem so easy? He asked, his hands resting on the keys. Grace sat down beside him on the piano bench, close enough that he could smell the subtle perfume of her hair. Close your eyes, she instructed softly. Take a deep breath. Let the music flow through you. Thomas obeyed, feeling her presence. Beside him, hearing her soft breathing. When his fingers touched the keys again, something had changed. The melody flowed more naturally, as if his hands had finally found the right path. See, she whispered, her voice close to his ear. You have music inside you. The first thunders began to echo in the distance, but inside the piano room, the world seemed to have stopped. Thomas opened his eyes slowly, turning to find Grace's face inches from his own. The air between them seemed charged with electricity, like the clouds outside. It was Emily who once again broke the moment, hurriedly entering the room. Mr. Blackwell, there's an urgent call from the office. Grace stood up quickly, her hands nervously smoothing her dress. I think that's enough for today, she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. We'll continue tomorrow. Thomas watched her leave the room, his heart beating in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the music he had just played. Something was changing between them, something that went beyond musical notes and piano lessons. That night, as the storm battered the city, Grace remained awake in her room at the back of the house, listening to the sound of the rain mixed with the melodies that wouldn't stop playing in her mind. On her nightstand, an old photo of her at the conservatory reminded her of long-abandoned dreams. On the other side of the house, in his master bedroom, Thomas also couldn't sleep. His sister Olivia's words echoed in his mind, warning about the complexity of the situation. But how to control feelings that, like the music that now filled his life, seemed to have a will of their own? Emily, the only silent witness to this unfolding story, observed everything with a mixture of concern and hope. Like a melody that builds slowly, note by note, something was being born in that house, something beautiful and frightening at the same time. The news of the audition at Carnegie Hall arrived like a bombshell for the mansion's staff. Emily was the first to know when she found Grace crying silently in the kitchen, holding an official letter with the hall's letterhead. It's 3 weeks from now, Grace explained, her voice trembling with emotion. Mr. Blackwell managed to arrange everything, but I don't know if I'm ready. Carnegie Hall's reputation was legendary. Its stages had received some of the greatest names in world classical music. The idea of playing in that sacred place made Grace's hands tremble every time she sat at the piano to practice. Thomas, noticing her anxiety, decided to completely reorganize the house routine. The mornings remained dedicated to his lessons, but now the afternoons were exclusively for Grace to practice. Emily took on most of the household tasks, allowing the pianist to focus on her preparation. "You need an appropriate dress for the performance," Thomas declared during a particularly productive afternoon. "I'm going to ask Olivia to accompany you to the best stores in the city." Grace tried to protest, but he gently interrupted her. "It's not a favor, it's an investment in your talent. Besides," he added with a smile, "I need my teacher with all the confidence possible to continue my lessons afterwards." The mention of the lessons brought a soft blush to Grace's cheeks. In recent weeks, something had subtly changed in the dynamic between them. The glances lingered a little longer, the silences carried unspoken meanings, and the music seemed to vibrate with a different intensity when they were together at the piano. Olivia arrived the next morning, bringing with her contagious energy and a list of exclusive boutiques. "We're going to transform you into a true concert pianist," she declared, naturally linking her arm with Grace's. The shopping expedition was a surreal experience for Grace. Accustomed to simple shops and modest clothes, she found herself immersed in a world of silks, laces, and fine fabrics. Olivia, with her keen eye and experience in social events, masterfully guided the choices. "This one," said Olivia, presenting a long dress in a deep shade of midnight blue. "It's perfect. Elegant without being ostentatious, classic without being outdated." When Grace emerged from the fitting room wearing the piece, even the saleswoman held her breath. The dress seemed to have been made to measure, falling perfectly over her forms and enhancing her naturally elegant posture. "Thomas will be speechless," Olivia commented with an enigmatic smile, observing Grace through the mirror. "Miss Olivia," Grace protested, blushing intensely. "It's not like that." "Isn't it?" Olivia questioned softly. "I've been observing you too, Grace. Music isn't the only thing blossoming in that house." Back at the mansion, the afternoon practice sessions gained a different intensity. Grace alternated between moments of absolute confidence and crises of insecurity. On one of these occasions, Thomas found her sitting at the piano, sheet music scattered and eyes misty. "What if I'm not good enough?" she asked when he approached. "What if all this investment, all this confidence you've placed in me—" "Grace," he interrupted, sitting down beside her on the piano bench. "You are more than good enough. You are extraordinary." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Thomas felt an almost irresistible urge to touch her face, to dry the tears that threatened to fall. But the moment was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. "Mr. Blackwell," Emily called from the door. "Mr. Albert Stevens is on the phone. He says it's urgent." Albert was the family lawyer and rarely called without an important reason. Thomas hesitated for a moment, torn between answering the call and staying there, beside Grace. "Go," she said softly. "I need to practice a bit more anyway." As he walked to his office, Thomas felt his heart in conflict. As a businessman, he had always known how to separate personal and professional life. But now, for the first time, the lines were dangerously blurred. The conversation with Albert was brief but impactful. The lawyer had discovered that some office employees were beginning to comment on the new situation at the Blackwell mansion. Rumors about the relationship between the powerful businessman and his housekeeper were already circulating in corporate corridors. "Thomas," Albert warned in his grave voice, "you need to think about your reputation, the company's image. This kind of comment can affect business partnerships." The lawyer's words hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. Not because of the possible damage to his business reputation, that surprisingly seemed less important now, but because of the realization of how the outside world could affect Grace. From the office, he could hear the piano notes floating through the air. Grace was practicing the piece chosen for the audition, a complex Chopin composition that required not only impeccable technique, but also deep emotional connection. Emily, passing through the hallway with a tea tray, paused for a moment to listen. In her many years of working in family homes, she had never witnessed a story like this. It was as if the music had the power to break down social barriers, to bring together worlds that would normally never touch. At night, when everyone had retired, Thomas remained in his office, his thoughts in turmoil. Albert's words mingled with Chopin's notes that still echoed in his mind. On his desk, the photo of his parents silently watched him, his mother at the piano, his father beside her, both smiling at the camera in a moment frozen in time. What would they say about this whole situation? His mother, who always believed in the transformative power of music, would probably understand. But his father, an old-school businessman who always valued maintaining social appearances. In the back room, Grace was also awake, her fingers moving silently over an imaginary piano. The blue dress, carefully hung in the wardrobe, represented more than a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of transformation, of possibilities, of resurrected dreams. But with each note she practiced, with each glance exchanged with Thomas, with each moment of unplanned proximity, she felt she was entering dangerous territory. The music was awakening not only her old artistic ambitions, but also feelings that she had sworn never to allow to flourish. The week preceding the audition at Carnegie Hall began with a subtle change in the atmosphere of the mansion. The rumors circulating in corporate corridors had reached the ears of the staff, creating a climate of veiled tension. Emily perceived the whispers that ceased when Grace entered the kitchen, the looks laden with unspoken meanings. Thomas also felt the weight of the changes. His visits to the construction company's headquarters became exercises in patience, with forced smiles and conversations that died when he approached. On one of these occasions, he caught two executives exchanging significant looks when he mentioned that he needed to return for his piano lessons. On a particularly tense morning, during the usual practice, Grace seemed especially distracted. Her hands, normally so sure over the keys, hesitated in passages she had mastered weeks ago. "Is something wrong?" Thomas asked, noticing her restlessness. Grace paused, her fingers hovering over the piano. "Mr. Blackwell, maybe we should cancel the audition." "What? But why? You're more than prepared." "It's not about being prepared," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "It's about people are talking about us, about the lessons, about everything." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. Of course, she had also noticed the rumors, the looks, the veiled comments. How could she not have noticed? "Grace, look at me," he asked, turning on the piano bench to face her. "What people say doesn't matter. What matters is your music, your talent, your dreams." "You don't understand," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "Your reputation, your company. I can't be responsible for harming everything you've built." "My reputation?" He let out a humorless laugh. "You know what I've realized in the last few weeks, that I've spent years building a reputation based on numbers, on business, on appearances. And it took you and your music to show me how empty all that is." The words hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Grace felt her heart race, but kept her hands firmly in her lap, resisting the urge to touch him. "Besides," he continued, his voice softer now, "everything's already arranged. The hall, the dress. Olivia wouldn't forgive me if we wasted all that shopping expedition." The mention of Olivia brought a small smile to Grace's lips. Thomas's sister had become an unexpected ally, calling almost daily to offer support and advice about the performance. "And there's one more thing," Thomas added, standing up and walking to a nearby drawer. "I was saving this for closer to the date, but I think you need to see it now." He returned with an elegant envelope, which he handed to Grace. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing a list of names. "They're confirmations of attendance for your performance," he explained. "Olivia helped locate some of your old conservatory colleagues, including—" He paused dramatically. "Bethany confirmed she's coming especially from Europe to watch." Grace felt tears fill her eyes. Bethany, her old colleague who had pursued an international career, the friend who had always believed in her talent. The idea of playing for her after so many years was simultaneously terrifying and exciting. But how? She could barely form the words. Olivia is very persistent when she wants something, Thomas smiled. And it seems Bethany never forgot the pianist who played with her soul, as she said. That afternoon, the practice gained a different intensity. Grace played as if her life depended on it, each note laden with long-repressed emotions. Thomas watched her, marveling at her transformation. She was no longer the shy housekeeper, but an artist in full flight. Emily, who occasionally passed through the room carrying out her daily tasks, noticed the subtle changes in the interaction between the two. The looks were longer, the smiles more frequent, the space between them on the piano bench ever smaller. During a break in practice, Thomas received another call from Albert, the lawyer. More rumors, more concerns about the company's image, more advice about maintaining appearances. But this time, instead of the anxiety these conversations used to provoke, Thomas felt only a deep certainty that he was on the right path. At night, after everyone had retired, Grace remained in the piano room. Her hands glided softly over the keys, reproducing the piece she would present at the audition. In the dimness, with only moonlight entering through the large windows, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined herself on the stage of Carnegie Hall under the lights, in front of an audience that would include not only Thomas and Olivia, but also Bethany and other faces from the past, people who had known her when she was just a young woman, full of dreams before life had led her down other paths. From the hallway, without her noticing, Thomas watched her. The vision of her at the piano, bathed in moonlight, playing with such passion and dedication, made his heart race in a way that no million-dollar deal ever had. At that moment, something crystallized in his mind. It didn't matter what people said. It didn't matter about the rumors or concerns about his reputation. The music that Grace brought to his life, the transformation she wrought in his world, was worth any price. In her room at the back of the house, the blue dress patiently awaited, a silent symbol of resurrected dreams and reborn possibilities. Beside it, on the small dresser, the old photo from the conservatory and the list of confirmations for the performance represented the bridge between the past and the future, between what was and what could be. The mansion finally fell silent, lulled only by the distant sound of waves breaking on the beach. But in the hearts of its inhabitants, a melody continued to play, a music of transformation, of courage, and of a love that, like the most beautiful compositions, was born not from the notes themselves, but from the silences between them. Only 3 days remained until the audition at Carnegie Hall, when an unexpected event shook the mansion's routine. Bethany, Grace's old colleague, arrived without warning, bringing with her the energy and glamour of the international classical music circuit. "I couldn't wait until the day of the performance," she declared, warmly embracing Grace in the entrance hall. "I needed to see with my own eyes if the rumors were true." Bethany looked stunning in her Chanel ensemble, her hair impeccably styled, and a posture that betrayed years of experience in the most prestigious cultural circles in Europe. Still, her eyes shone with the same sincerity that Grace remembered from their conservatory days. "What rumors?" Grace asked, feeling a chill down her spine. "Why that, my dear friend, the most talented pianist I've ever known would finally return to the stage," Bethany replied, closely observing her friend's reaction. "But I confess I was intrigued by the circumstances. A housekeeper who becomes her employer's piano teacher. That would make a great romance, don't you think?" Thomas, who was observing the scene a few steps behind, noticed how Grace blushed at the comment. Emily, always attentive, hurried to offer drinks and lead the illustrious visitor to the living room. "So," Bethany began, elegantly settling into an armchair, "tell me everything. How did music come back into your life after so many years?" The afternoon turned into a journey to the past. Bethany and Grace reminisced about their conservatory days, the performances, the shared dreams. Thomas listened fascinated to the stories, discovering a new dimension of his piano teacher's life. "I remember perfectly the last time we performed together," Bethany said, her eyes lost in memories. "You played Chopin like I had never heard before. Dr. Frank said you had the rare gift of making the piano cry." Grace lowered her eyes, moved by the memory. "Those were different times. Talent doesn't disappear with time, darling," Bethany affirmed with conviction. It's just dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. As the friends talked, Thomas noticed something different in Grace's behavior. It was as if Bethany's presence had awakened a part of her that remained hidden, the artist that existed beneath the surface of the dedicated employee. "Mr. Blackwell," Bethany called, turning to him. "I'd like to hear your version of this story. How did you discover Grace's hidden talent?" Before he could answer, Albert, his lawyer, burst into the room, followed by a visibly embarrassed Emily. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell," said Emily. "He insisted it was urgent." Albert stopped abruptly upon noticing the presence of visitors. His face, normally impassive, betrayed an unusual urgency. "Thomas, we need to talk. In private." The mood in the room changed instantly. Bethany, with the perspicacity developed over years of social interaction, sensed the tension in the air. "Grace, darling," she said, rising gracefully, "why don't you show me the piano? I'd love to hear how the piece for the audition is coming along." When they were alone in the office, Albert wasted no time with preliminaries. "The board is calling. An extraordinary meeting," he announced. "The rumors about your involvement with an employee are affecting negotiations with the Chinese investors." Thomas felt his blood boil. "What involvement? Grace is my piano teacher." "A housekeeper who now gives piano lessons to her employer and is going to perform at Carnegie Hall with all your support?" Albert retorted. "Thomas, you need to see how this looks to others." From downstairs, piano notes floated up to the office. Grace was playing the piece chosen for the audition, her music stronger and more confident with Bethany's encouraging presence. "You know what I see, Albert," Thomas responded, his voice laden with contained emotion. "I see an extraordinary artist whom life forced to hide her talent. I see someone who has taught me more about music, about beauty, and about life in the last few months than I learned in years of business." "Thomas," Albert sighed, "you're in love with her." The statement hung in the air like a sustained note. It wasn't a question, but a realization that Thomas wasn't prepared to face. Downstairs, Bethany watched her friend play, noticing the subtle changes in her technique, the maturity that the years had added to her interpretation. But mainly, she noticed how her eyes shone in a different way when she talked about the lessons with Thomas. "You're in love with him too, aren't you?" Bethany asked softly during a pause in the music. Grace felt her heart stop for a moment. "Bethany, please. It's not like that." "Darling," Bethany smiled, "I'm a pianist. I live by interpreting emotions through music. And the way you play now, there's love in every note." Emily, who was discreetly tidying the adjacent room, couldn't help but overhear the conversation. Her heart tightened, worried about how this story would unfold. Night fell over the mansion, bringing more questions than answers. Bethany was accommodated in one of the guest rooms, her presence adding a new layer of complexity to the already delicate situation. In his office, Thomas remained awake, Albert's words echoing in his mind. In the back room, Grace also couldn't sleep. Bethany's questions, stirring feelings she had desperately tried to ignore. The full moon illuminated the choppy sea, as if nature itself reflected the turmoil in the hearts of the mansion's inhabitants. In 2 days, Grace would perform at Carnegie Hall, fulfilling a long-abandoned dream. But now, that dream was intertwined with feelings and complications that no one could have foreseen. The piano in the main room remained silent, awaiting the next act of this story, which, like a complex musical piece, was building in crescendo towards its inevitable climax, the eve of the performance dawned with a different energy hovering over the mansion. Breakfast, served on the veranda as usual, transformed into an almost formal event with Bethany's presence, who enchanted everyone with stories of her tours across Europe. "I remember my first performance at the Royal Albert Hall," she commented, as Emily served more coffee. "My hands were shaking so much I thought I wouldn't be able to play the first note. But then something magical happened." Grace listened attentively, her own hands holding the cup too tightly, betraying her nervousness. Thomas, seated at the head of the table, observed her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Mr. Blackwell," Emily called discreetly, "Mr. Stevens is on the phone again. He says the board is waiting for an answer." A tense silence fell over the table. Bethany, perceptive as always, sensed that something important was happening. "Grace, darling," she said, rising elegantly, "why don't we go to the piano? I'd like to rehearse a duet with you like in the old days." As the two friends headed to the music room, Thomas went to his office, the weight of the decisions he needed to make heavy on his shoulders. The call with Albert was brief but decisive. "The board scheduled the meeting for tomorrow at 10 a.m., the lawyer informed. Exactly during the performance at Carnegie Hall. Thomas felt his stomach sink. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a veiled ultimatum. Choose the board or choose her. In the music room, Bethany and Grace relived moments from the past, their hands, dancing together over the piano keys in a perfect duet. The music they created together was of transcendental beauty, blending technique and emotion in a way that only great artists can achieve. "You should never have stopped playing," Bethany said when they finished. "Your place is on the great stages, not serving coffee in mansions." Grace felt her face burn. "Life doesn't always allow us to choose our paths, Bethany. But sometimes it gives us a second chance," her friend replied, casting a significant look towards Thomas's office. "The question is, are you ready to seize it?" The afternoon brought with it a series of final preparations. Olivia arrived carrying a box with carefully chosen accessories to complement the blue dress. Emily helped with the details, while Bethany supervised everything with her experienced eye as an international artist. "Tomorrow," Olivia declared, "you won't just be Grace, the pianist, you'll be a reborn artist." In his office, Thomas faced his own internal battle. The board's email blinked on his screen, detailing the possible consequences of his absence from the meeting. Years of work, millions in investments, his company's reputation, everything was at stake. When night came, bringing with it a fine, melancholic rain, the mansion plunged into an expectant silence. In the guest room, Bethany made calls to her contacts in the music world, ensuring that Grace's performance would get the attention it deserved. Olivia, who decided to spend the night at the mansion, was talking with her brother in the office. "You need to be there tomorrow, Thomas," she was saying, "not just for the music, but for everything it represents." "The board," he began. "The board will always exist," Olivia interrupted, "but moments like this are unique. You need to decide what really matters in your life." In the back room, Grace sat on her small bed, the blue dress hanging on the wardrobe door like a silent promise. In her hands, she held the old photo from the conservatory, where a young woman full of dreams smiled at the future. Emily knocked softly at the door, bringing a calming tea. "Nervous?" she asked gently. "Terrified," Grace admitted with a small smile. "It's not just the performance, Emily, it's everything. All the changes, all the feelings. Love sometimes arrives at the most unexpected moments," Emily said wisely, surprising Grace with her insight. The rain continued to fall outside, its patter on the windows creating its own melody. Upstairs, Thomas paced restlessly in his room, Olivia's words mixing in his mind with the piano notes that had filled his life with meaning for months. At some point in the early hours, when the silence was almost absolute, Grace got up and walked silently to the piano room. Her hands trembled when she touched the keys, producing almost inaudible notes. From the top of the stairs, Thomas watched her, his heart beating in a rhythm that had nothing to do with music. The decision he needed to make had never seemed so clear and so frightening at the same time. The next day would bring not just a musical performance, but a moment of truth for all involved. Like a complex symphony reaching its final movement, all the notes, all the feelings, all the decisions converged to a single point in time. The rain finally ceased, leaving in the air that feeling of new beginnings that only mornings after storms can bring. In a few hours, Carnegie Hall would open its doors for a performance that promised to be much more than a simple piano recital. It would be the moment when music and hearts would finally find their true harmony. Carnegie Hall gleamed in the golden morning light. The first guests were already beginning to arrive, filling the historic lobby with murmurs of expectation. Olivia personally supervised the final details, ensuring everything was perfect for the big moment. Backstage, Grace sat in front of the mirror in the main dressing room, her hands resting gently on the blue dress, that now seemed to be a part of her. Bethany adjusted the final details of her hairstyle, while Emily discreetly organized the sheet. Music. "Remember," Bethany was saying, "you're not just playing the piano today. You're telling your story, our story, the story of all the dreams that needed to wait for the right moment to bloom." The clock marked 9:30 a.m. At the Blackwell construction headquarters, the board of directors was beginning to gather. Thomas's chair remained empty, generating uneasy glances among those present. Albert nervously consulted his phone, waiting for news. Back at the hall, Olivia was receiving special guests, old conservatory colleagues, music critics, personalities from the classical music world. News of the rediscovered pianist had spread quickly through the city's cultural circles, generating genuine curiosity. 9:45 a.m. Grace peeked through the stage curtain, her heart racing as she saw the audience almost complete. In the front row, several familiar faces from her conservatory days, but the absence that weighed most heavily was Thomas's. "He'll come," Olivia whispered, approaching from behind. "My brother can be stubborn, but his heart knows where it should be." At the construction company, the board meeting was about to begin. Albert stood up to make the initial presentation when the door to the room opened. Everyone turned, expecting to see Thomas. Instead, it was his assistant carrying a sealed envelope. 9:55 a.m. The murmur in the theater gradually diminished. The black grand piano shone under the stage lights, awaiting its interpreter. Backstage, Grace took deep breaths, her slightly trembling hands being held by Bethany. 5 minutes, the theater director gently announced. It was at this moment that Emily came running into the dressing room, her eyes shining with excitement. "He's here!" In the theater lobby, Thomas adjusted the tie of his tuxedo, his heart beating at an accelerated rhythm. In the boardroom, his assistant opened the envelope, revealing his letter of resignation from the executive presidency of the construction company. 10 a.m. The theater lights dimmed softly. The audience fell silent in anticipation. Grace walked to the center of the stage, the blue dress shimmering under the spotlights. Her eyes immediately found Thomas's in the front row, seated between Olivia and Bethany. At that moment, all nervousness disappeared. Sitting at the piano, Grace closed her eyes for an instant, letting the memories flow. The conservatory, the years of work, the mornings of lessons with Thomas, the shared moments, the discovered feelings. When her fingers touched the first notes of Chopin, the entire theater held its breath. The music that emerged from the piano wasn't just technically perfect. It was a story of love, of overcoming, of reborn dreams. Thomas watched hypnotized, each note touching his heart in a way that no business success ever had. Beside him, Olivia held his hand, silent tears running down her face. Grace's performance transcended music. It was as if every moment of her life, the joys, the pains, the deferred dreams, the discovered love, was being translated into notes that filled the theater with pure emotion. When the last note resounded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, like a wave, the entire audience rose in a thunderous ovation. Flowers began to rain on the stage. Critics applauded enthusiastically. Old conservatory colleagues shouted, "Bravo," with tears in their eyes. But Grace only had eyes for one person. Thomas rose from his seat and walked to the stage, climbing the steps without caring about protocols or social conventions. There, under the lights and applause, he took Grace's hands in his. "You changed my life," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "The music was just the beginning. You taught me to see beauty where I only saw numbers, to feel when I only thought, to love when I merely existed." Grace, tears freely running down her face, squeezed his hands. "And you gave me back my dreams," she responded softly. "You made me believe that it's never too late to start over." The applause continued, now mixed with emotional sighs from the audience. Olivia and Bethany embraced each other, crying and laughing at the same time. Emily, backstage, discreetly wiped her eyes with her apron. That morning, Carnegie Hall witnessed more than a piano recital. It was the stage for a love story that transcended social classes, prejudices, and conventions. A story that began with musical notes and ended with hearts in perfect harmony. Months later, the beachfront mansion continued to be a stage for music and love. The piano now had two official pianists, Grace, who became a respected concert performer, giving regular performances, and Thomas, who discovered that his true wealth wasn't in business, but in the music and love that transformed his life. The Guy mornings were still dedicated to piano lessons, but now they were moments shared between equals, between lovers, between souls that had found their common melody. Emily continued to serve coffee and organize the house, but now with a permanent smile as she listened to the notes that filled the environment. And every night when the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Thomas and Grace sat at the piano. Their hands met over the keys, creating music that spoke of love, courage, and realized dreams. Because sometimes, life is like a great symphony. It needs time to develop its themes, build its harmony, and find its perfect resolution. And in that beachside house, two souls discovered that love, like the most beautiful music, knows no barriers, follows no conventions, and has the power to transform lives forever.